seated.
Good morning. In this message, I want to focus on two questions. I want to invite you to consider these questions. If you really dig down to the roots of your worldview assumptions, what do you think you really expect from God? And what expectations do you have about your life and what it should look like in this world? So hang on to that question. Secondly, what do you think God expects from us? From you, from me? I believe that these are critical and necessary check-in questions that we need to ask ourselves and to one another to assess the health and trajectory of our faith development. And I've been convinced of the importance of these questions, in large part due to the research and thinking that I've been doing around evangelical deconversions for the large part of 10 years, specifically investigating how and why evangelical ministers have left the Christian faith. And I'm going to bring this back around at the end of this talk. So with these two framing questions in mind, let's turn to our text for today in Exodus 16. And to better understand the larger canonical significance of the manna story, God's provision of manna, etc., we need to situate it within the larger context of the Exodus story. And I think doing so will also help us to better connect these two framing questions that I proposed with what's going on in the manna story. So consider Israelites whose families had been enslaved for generations, let's say 430 years, had experienced a dramatic deliverance from mighty Pharaoh. The Israelites, they witnessed firsthand the supernatural plagues, the death and the sparing of the firstborn sons, the harrowing escape through the Red Sea. Events that were so significant that when future generations were veering off the path of covenant faithfulness, the prophets would come by and say repeatedly, remember the Lord your God who delivered you out of Egypt. And they were told to look back at these events to refresh their collective memories, to recalibrate their perspectives about God in light of these events. Because these events were clear demonstrations, clear evidences of God's faithfulness, of his power, and his trustworthiness. But we know, fresh off of having these experiences, having experienced a miraculous deliverance, just days into their journey into the Sinai Peninsula, we read that they begin to grumble about the lack of water to drink. Why, oh why had God brought us out to Egypt? At least there we have food and water to drink. At least we had shelter. Are we not better off living as slaves in Egypt rather than die out here in this barren wilderness? Now, if I'm being honest, I do wonder if I would have been part of the malcontents. And I want to invite you to ask the same question. Would you have been part of those who were grumbling? Think back to moments when you were experiencing a strong sense of discontent, when you found yourself murmuring or complaining. Perhaps it was just complaining internally to yourself, or maybe it was out loud about a coworker, about a classmate, about a friend, maybe even a professor, maybe it's even me, I don't know, about something they did or didn't do. Perhaps it was complaining about a situation that you thought was unfair, or something that just wasn't to your liking. Maybe it's just the line was too long in the cafeteria. Don't quite like how they prepared this food. Or in my case, frequently happens, the person in front of me is just driving too slow, and they're blocking the lanes. Grumbling or complaining is often tied to unmet expectations. When what we want to happen or think should happen does not happen, and that can result in disappointment, in anger, in confusion, or even disillusionment. And if we stop and examine what actually lies underneath our discontent, I suspect that we will find a tangled web of assumptions, of beliefs, of values, and expectations. And if I'm being honest, just like the ancient Jews, I often project my ideas of how God should act and how this world should be. And when my experience and my reality doesn't match my expectations, I grumble and I complain. And so perhaps the Israelites, they grumbled because their experience in the wilderness did not align with their vision or expectations of what God's deliverance should look like. Perhaps some grumbled because, in part, they were just focused on their immediate needs of getting water or getting food. And they failed to see the challenges that they were experiencing in light of God's greater purposes. In any case, those that grumbled needed a realignment of their expectations. They needed a better lens through which to interpret their experiences. And I think this is in part was what Moses was doing right before they went into the promised land, as he accounted in Deuteronomy 8:1-5. And there he explains to them and reminds them of why God allowed them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And so let me just read this. It says, "Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, caused you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you." God led Israel into the wilderness, a place of barrenness and scarcity, not to harm them, but to prepare them to live as his chosen, his holy, his contrast people in the promised land, so that they would become a house of prayer, a conduit of blessing to all the nations and to all peoples. So this time in the desert was necessary preparatory work. This harsh wilderness functioned like a mirror that revealed the condition of their hearts. Who are what they valued? Who are what they trusted? It was a time of testing, a time of training to refine their faith, and it became quickly clear that there was much for them to learn, but also to unlearn, as they had a distorted view of who God was and who they were. The way God provided the manna and the instructions that he gave regarding how they should be collected both tested the quality of their faith and trained them to increase their trust in God's provision. So what do I mean by the quality of faith? Isn't faith just belief? Like you either believe it or you don't. Is it kind of binary? Regarding the nature of biblical faith, some reformers spoke of 3 levels of faith that build on top of each other. At the base level is notitia, or an awareness or understanding of something. And then there is assensus. Not only are you aware or understand something, you actually assent to it to be true. You give it a level of factity. The third level or measure of faith is fiducia, or trust. And I suggest to you that biblical faith, I believe, encompasses all 3. We not only understand something and affirm it to be true, we act upon the assumption of this truth. James 2:18-19 says, "But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder.'" See, this passage solidified it for me that the reformers actually had it right with regard to the nature of biblical faith. James seems to be making the argument here that the demons are quite orthodox in certain ways in their beliefs. They probably did not deny the existence of God. And I suspect that they did not deny the historicity of the resurrection. They have that understanding. They've witnessed it. They might even affirm it to be true. What they lack then is fiducia, or trust. Relating this back to the story of the manna, how did God test the quality of their faith? They were told to collect only what they needed for the day, or in the case of the day before the Sabbath, to collect for 2 days. If they truly trusted God to provide, if they truly had faith at these 3 levels that we just talked about, there would be no need for them to hoard, as some did, because they were acting upon what they believed to be true about God, about his character, about his faithfulness. Beyond acknowledging the great things that God has done in the past, as part of the preparatory work in the wilderness, God was then inviting his people to appropriate and internalize these truths to inform how they see and relate to God in the present and in the future. So the question is, will they trust that God would continue to do what he had promised? For us today, to be a Christian is not simply to acknowledge facts about God and Jesus. Remember, even the demons believe. Biblical faith is to trust or follow the person of Christ such that it is made evident in the way that we live our lives. Faith is not just about cognitive assent. Faith that pleases God is about allegiance. Who and what do you love and give your life to? Some of you might be wondering how we go from the story of Manna to Jesus. What's the link here? So while there's lessons to be learned from the Exodus account, ultimately, when we read the Bible canonically, as we examine the entire biblical meta-narrative, the arc of the human story, all of this leads to Jesus as the ultimate deliverer, the Messiah, the rescuer, the triumphant king. Jesus enters into and reenacts the human story, with the difference being that Jesus succeeds where all the people in the biblical narrative have failed, just along the lines. So, for example, he was tested and tempted in the desert, just like Israel was. But unlike Israel, Jesus responded in trust by reciting Deuteronomy 8. Man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And so Jesus has succeeded such that he is the greater Adam. He is the greater Moses who has secured a greater exodus for us. He is the greater manna, the bread of life, the Lord of the Sabbath, who offers a greater rest. So the proper response to the question, what does God expect from us, is simply to throw ourselves at the feet of this greater Moses, who has conquered sin, death, and the devil, and follow our Lord and Savior, who models for us what it means to be fully human. So here's where we've come so far. Our missionary God brought Israel out of Egypt and into the wilderness to prepare them to live as his people and as a light to all nations. This preparation for Israel included testing and training. Testing that reveals the quality of their faith and the posture of their hearts towards Yahweh. The hope then was that they would learn to see God for who he really is and choose to trust and obey. And yet their actions, like grumbling and disobeying God by hoarding manna, reveal deeper issues. Namely, we have focused on the internalization of misguided assumptions and expectations about God and their situation. And really, when directed towards God, grumbling just isn't complaining. It's rebellion. It's a refusal to trust God's provision and his timing. It's demanding that God meets our expectations instead of surrendering to his plan. Now, for the rest of our time, I want to relate the importance of monitoring and recalibrating our expectations with what I have learned in researching evangelical deconversions. I'm going to offer you some suggestions on how we might answer those two framing questions that I posed at the beginning. You guys remember the questions? One, what do we expect? Say briefly. And then what does God expect from us? All right, these two framing questions. So let me just share this. So in the past 2 months, I've logged in probably like over 50 hours in talking to about 25 people and hearing their stories about how and why they left the Christian faith. These are people who have served in Christian vocational ministry for a certain number of years, who had theological training, but subsequently abandoned not just ministry, but they left the Christian faith behind. And so, to use biblical imagery, these are people who made a shipwreck of their faith. What I would say here is like us, all of them had formed expectations. For example, expectations about the efficacy of prayer. Expectations about how the Bible should read and line up. Expectations about how God should act in the world. Expectations about seeing more of a visible, demonstrated impact of the Christian faith in the lives of people around them and in the church. Expectations about what they should experience in their Christian life, given all the grand promises that the Bible makes about the spiritual resources that we have. Human beings are very complex. So trying to make sense of why their faith unraveled, I'm going to say up front, is very complex. And it'll take much more time than I have this morning. There is a tangled web of factors and processes at work. But one thread that commonly appears in a lot of these deconversion narratives has to do with a faith crisis that is precipitated when their life, their lived experiences don't line up with their expectations. My last conversation was a couple days ago with a longtime director of a Christian community center. For many years, he worked among urban poor, impoverished, under-resourced urban youths. And he was recounting how he was shaken, and he was from the suburbs. So he kind of relocated, doing the Christian and community development thing, the relocation. And he was just shaken by how much death and social dysfunction surrounded him. It was all in his community. At one point I asked him, is it accurate to say that you had a certain set of expectations that God would intervene in these things? And when it didn't seem to be happening, when you were crying out in prayer and you didn't hear anything on the other end, it triggered a crisis for you. And he responded, absolutely. That was my Pentecostal upbringing. Let me just pause right there. Because I want to make sure that you guys are not mistaking me here. I did find it really interesting that very thoughtfully pointed out his Pentecostal upbringing. I want to preface this by saying, I am not saying that there is anything inherently defective in certain streams of Christian faith, whether it's the charismatic stream or the Pentecostal stream. In fact, I take the opposite view that we have, because all of us have blind spots, it actually benefits us to engage with people from other streams of the Christian faith, to learn from them, to have a posture of learning. But what I will say is that when it comes to this experience thread, this disillusionment that arises from a discontinuity between my expectations and then my lived reality, it seems to disproportionately happen with people whose Christian faith was formed in charismatic and Pentecostal streams. And I think this is what he's alluding to here. Because in that variety of the Christian faith, there are many strengths to it. There is a right emphasis on the work and the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit in our lives. But that version of the Christian faith also leads to expectations about immediacy in my experience. It's much more in tune to experiencing God in a particular way. And so what he's saying here is that perhaps it's my Pentecostal upbringing that led me to have these expectations that I had. These expectations that I used to understand and interpret the experiences that I was having. And it just wasn't lining up. So he goes on to just give an example of an argument that he had with his wife. And his wife is still a committed Christian, takes his kids to church, is committed. And that just creates an interesting and weird dynamic. Again, outside the scope of this talk. But he was explaining it to his wife this way. Let me just read what he said. You have a high expectation of me from answering when I call, but I'm limited. He's saying he's a human being, so he's a limited person. He recognizes that. But you have no expectation for your deity to answer, and he's all-powerful. That would just seem upside down to me to have no expectations, and I had expectations. Do you see what he's doing here? He's acknowledging that he had expectations of God, that God would act in a certain way, and that these expectations were informed by his Christian upbringing, by the version of the Christian faith that he was socialized into. But he's also doing something else, where he is measuring God, what he does, what he should do, using himself as a father and a husband as the measuring stick. So what he's saying here is that I wouldn't do that. And I'm a flawed human being. And it doesn't make sense that God, the Father, would do that. You guys see what he's saying here? So what I've come to believe through this research is that the people I've talked to are not just leaving behind the Christian faith. They are. They are leaving behind a particular version, their version of the Christian faith. They are not just rejecting God. They're rejecting a particular projection of God. And this is exactly what the Israelites are doing. They're grumbling against a particular projection or perception of God. And they're not just discarding the Bible, they are discarding a particular understanding of the Bible that they had been taught. And so in a similar way, all of us have been socialized into and nurtured within a particular stream of the Christian faith that has informed how we understand and live out our Christian identity and faith. And I suspect, we're at Wheaton College, I suspect that many of you have been swimming in the same evangelical stream that I've had for many years, which is one of many tributaries within the larger historic Christian faith. And yet, all of us who identify as Christ followers, we have to recognize, have different versions of the Christian faith that have developed over time through your unique mix of personal disposition, your experiences, your inclinations, your leanings. And so there is both continuity and discontinuity between your version of the Christian faith and mine, and that with the person sitting next to you. And it's this confluence of factors that help shape your version of the Christian faith, which simultaneously informs all sorts of expectations that we have formed about God, about ourselves, and about this world. What's normal? How should God act or show up in the world? How much victory or opposition should we expect to encounter in this world? Oh, yes. And so one of the hopes that I had in doing this research and focusing specifically on evangelicals was to understand the common stress points that American evangelical faith seems to have. And real short, I'll just point to some things for you guys to think about. And since Dr. Ford is up here, I'm just going to use the example of music. I would characterize American evangelicalism as quite triumphalistic in the version of the faith. Let me just give one example of that here. We learn a lot, because CCM is pretty big in our stream of the Christian faith, right? We love to sing our songs of Hillsong. It's great. And so we actually learn a lot of our theology. We form a lot of our assumptions, our expectations, based on the songs we sing. And so if you look at the corpus of songs that you typically sing in your churches, just really examine them. I see a disparity between what I see in the Psalms, where I actually see a big portion of it has laments, which I see missing in the corpus of songs that we sing as expressions of our faith and our longings. Our faith is quite triumphant, and it's very individualistic. Culturally, we're trained to think about what benefits us individually and not think of the collective whole. All of these things work to shape us and our expectations, and it sets us up on a certain faith trajectory. So our faith and relationship with God erodes when we measure God by our expectations rather than aligning our expectations with his characters and purpose. So, getting to the conclusion, all of us need to do this realignment work in our lives. And let me just offer 2 recommendations here as you do this realignment work. And by this I mean we need to intentionally and thoughtfully examine our expectations that we have formed. When you encounter a crisis, ask yourself, what is it that's underneath? What is it that I'm actually assuming and expecting that leads me to feel this way? And so when you do it, first of all, do it. That's my first recommendation. Actually do this work. We must examine our expectations and our assumption and seek to realign them to conform to who God really is and what God's purposes are. Secondly, you should do this work in the context of community. It would take me a long time to explain this, but something happens when people decide to remove themselves from Christian community. That deconversion process accelerates when people are outside of the Christian community. So do this among those who truly love you and who have shown them to be mature and reliable guides. Let me close with this. For the rest of your life, you should expect to encounter crises of various kinds, which can it ranges from relatively mild things like you didn't get the job you wanted, that you really thought God had for you, all the way to knee-wobbling things, like when my wife and I found out with our second pregnancy that our child had this fatal congenital disease that meant that she wouldn't live outside the womb very long. But when we're encountering these crises, the choices are always the same. Do you walk by faith or by sight? And even when you do not see a way forward and things don't make sense, at our ant-like ground level, do you choose to trust God in His infinite wisdom and goodness of His purposes? Friends, beyond this talk, if there are those of you here who are just experiencing any sort of crisis, know that you can reach out to me, and I'm sure that there are many people in your life that you can reach out to. Let's do this work of examining our assumptions and submit it to God and realign them, not to our expectations of what we want, but according to what God has revealed about Himself and His purposes. Blessings to you, my friends.